I still remember the way the air smelled that night, warm butter-roasted turkey, and the faint sting of cinnamon candles burning in every corner of her perfect house. It was the kind of Thanksgiving my sister lived for, the kind that looked expensive even before you walked through the door. Monica always knew how to make a room notice her. The lights, the laughter, the soft click of her heels across the floor. Everything choreographed like she was hosting a reality show about success. I walked in holding the chicken Ethan and I had roasted ourselves. My son's small hands gripped the dish so tight, his knuckles turned white. Monica looked at us, smiled that smile that never reached her eyes, and said how brave it was that I'd come after the divorce. Brave like showing up made me pitiful. Dinner was a blur of glass and gold. When the toast began, Monica's voice rose above the noise. She thanked her guests, praised her husband, and then looked straight at me. And then she said it. Calm, casual, cruel. That some people and their children just didn't belong at this table. The laughter that followed burned worse than any insult. Even my mother looked away. I felt Ethan's hand trembling under the table, and I realized something in me had gone completely still. That night, under the glow of her perfect chandeliers, my sister taught me my place. What she didn't know was that the house she was so proud of was already mine. The smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon candles filled the air long before I reached my sister's front door. The house stood like a trophy at the end of a cul-de-sac in suburban Connecticut, trimmed hedges, stone walkway, a wreath of gold leaves hanging perfectly centered. It was Monica's dream home, the one she loved to remind everyone she had worked so hard for. I parked by the curb, glanced at the back seat. Ethan clutched the dish of roasted chicken we had made that morning. His small hands were covered in foil smudges, eyes bright with hope. He whispered, "Do you think Aunt Monica will like it this time, Mom?" I smiled, though my stomach tightened. "She'll love it, sweetheart. It's Thanksgiving." Inside, laughter and the soft clinking of glasses spilled from the dining room. Monica opened the door in a cream cashmere sweater and pearls. Her hair curled like she had just stepped out of a salon. Her eyes swept over my thrift store coat and the wine bottle I held wrapped in paper. "You made it," she said, her smile precise, controlled. "I almost didn't expect you." I handed her the bottle. "It's a California blend, nothing fancy, but it's good." She nodded politely, taking it between her manicured fingers. "Well, we already opened a few nicer ones, but I'm sure someone will enjoy it later." Behind her, the living room gleamed with perfection. Candles flickered across the marble counter. Family portraits lined the wall. Monica, her husband Michael, their 2 children, even Mom smiling beside them. Not one photo of me or Ethan. Mom appeared, lipstick too bright, voice sharp as ever. "Emily, you look tired. Are you still working that accounting job in Chicago?" "You really should think about remarrying, dear. A woman alone at your age." I forced a smile. "Nice to see you too, Mom." Ethan tugged my sleeve. "Grandma, look, I made pumpkin cookies." Mom patted his head gently, but her eyes slid away. "How sweet. Maybe we can set them on the kids' table." The dining room stretched long and gleaming, a linen cloth of ivory white golden chargers and a centerpiece of autumn leaves. Monica directed everything like a conductor, her friends from the neighborhood, her husband's colleagues, even the neighbors from across the street. I carried our chicken dish to the counter, feeling eyes on me. A woman whispered near the wine rack, "Isn't that her sister, the divorced one?" I kept my chin up, pretending not to hear. Dinner began with a toast. Michael raised his glass, thanked everyone for coming, praised Monica for the beautiful meal. She laughed modestly, soaking in the admiration. Then, as everyone began to take their seats, she looked toward me. "Emily, you and Ethan can sit over there," she said, pointing toward a small table near the patio doors. I hesitated. "There are seats here at the main table," I said quietly. She tilted her head, smiling like it was nothing. "This table's for the adults. The kids have their own setup. It's just easier." For a moment, silence spread through the room. Someone cleared their throat. Silverware clinked. Mom smoothed her napkin. "You know your sister likes order, dear. Let's not make a fuss." Ethan looked up at me, confused. But Mom, I want to sit with you. I bent down, smoothing his hair. It's okay, honey. We'll sit together over there. At the side table near the glass doors, the light felt colder. The laughter from the main table floated toward us like a song we weren't invited to sing. I cut small pieces of chicken for Ethan, trying to make it seem fun, but his shoulders slumped. He whispered, "Did we do something wrong?" I shook my head. "Of course not. We'll remember this dinner." "Okay." He nodded slowly, eyes glistening under the warm lights. A few seats down, an older man in a faded brown jacket watched quietly. His face was lined, hands rough like someone who had worked with wood. He leaned toward Ethan and said in a low voice, "I built this house years ago. Back then it was smaller, but strong. Funny thing seeing who shows it off now." I met his eyes. "You built it." He smiled softly. "Yeah. Name's George. I did the foundation work before they added the extension. Strong bones underneath all that polish." He winked at Ethan. "Don't let anyone tell you where you belong, kid." Before I could reply, Monica's voice rang out from the main table. "Emily, could you pass that gravy boat over here? The one near you?" I rose, walked the few steps, handed it to her. She smiled sweetly. "You really should try to earn a seat next time instead of just showing up." The table laughed lightly, unsure if it was a joke. My mother sipped her wine. I stood still for a moment, the scent of roasted turkey and perfume heavy in the air. Then I nodded once, returned to Ethan. He didn't look up. Outside, the sky had turned purple, the first snow beginning to fall. Through the window I could see my reflection, calm, collected, uninvited. As I helped Ethan with his plate, Monica's laughter echoed behind me, bright and hollow. In that moment I felt something shift deep inside. The humiliation burned quietly, but it didn't crush me. It shaped me. I took Ethan's hand, squeezed it gently. "Eat your dinner, sweetheart. We're almost done here." He nodded, a small, brave smile returning. Across the room, George caught my eye again, a silent understanding passing between us. He gave a single nod, as if he knew something I didn't yet. And for the first time that night, I didn't feel small. I just felt awake. I couldn't sleep that night. The image of George's quiet nod replayed in my head as I lay awake, staring at the ceiling of my small apartment in Chicago. The hum of the city outside felt far away, like another life entirely. Maybe it was. Something in me had shifted at that table, something that wouldn't settle back into silence. 2 years earlier, Monica's perfect house hadn't been so perfect. Back then, her husband Michael had called me in a panic. His investments had gone bad, and the mortgage payments had stopped. I still remember the tremor in his voice when he said, "The bank's taking the house, Emily. If they foreclose, Monica will never forgive me." I should have said it wasn't my problem. I should have let them face the mess they built. But when he said those words, Dad's house, I froze. That house was more than wood and glass. It was where we used to sit on the porch eating ice cream, while Dad told us to be kind, but never blind. It was the only thing left of him. The next morning, I took a train downtown to the bank's office. The manager looked surprised when I asked about purchasing the defaulted mortgage. He warned me it was a complicated process, that I'd be responsible for property taxes, maintenance, legal filings. I signed anyway. I formed a small holding company called Whitmore Trust, using savings from my consulting work and a quiet loan against my retirement fund. I didn't tell anyone. Not Mom, not Ethan, and definitely not Monica. When I signed the papers, I thought I was doing something good. I thought I was saving what was left of our family. I didn't realize I was just buying time for someone who had already erased me. The documents came through 2 weeks later. Whitmore Trust now held the note to the property at 29 Hillcrest Drive. It meant that technically I owned the debt, and if payments failed again, I could claim the title. It also meant Monica didn't owe me gratitude. She didn't even know I existed in the picture. That suited me fine. I didn't want thanks. I just wanted peace. Dad's voice echoed in my mind the way it had the day he got sick. "Whoever keeps this house standing," he said, "will deserve to call it theirs." He had looked at Monica when he said it, but I'd been the one holding his hand. Months later, I found out what she'd done. A routine audit at work crossed my desk. Her name appeared on a property document with a familiar signature. My father's. Except the date was wrong. He'd already passed by then. I called the notary, listed a man named George Wilson. His voice cracked with guilt when he recognized my name. He told me everything. How Monica had come to him with the paperwork, how she said our father had simply been too weak to appear in person, how she'd slipped him an envelope afterward. I remember gripping the phone so hard it left marks on my palm. George had quit that same year. He'd kept a copy of the real document, he said, tucked away, in case his conscience ever demanded it. I thanked him, but I couldn't speak after that. The years went by quietly. I paid the property taxes through Whitmore Trust, watched the statements come in with Monica's name at the top and mine buried behind the curtain. I convinced myself it was enough to know the truth. Until that Thanksgiving. That night after the dinner, I opened my laptop. The screen glowed cold in the dark room. My email was filled with work notices, receipts, and at the bottom, one new message. The sender was George. The subject line read, "Just in case you ever need it." Inside was a scanned copy of the original deed, signed by my father, unaltered, notarized properly. Attached was his message, "If you ever want to take back what's rightfully yours, I still have the original." My heart pounded as I stared at the document. The ink was faded, but the signature was real. It felt like Dad's voice reaching through the years, asking what I was going to do now. I poured myself a glass of wine, the cheap kind Monica would have laughed at, and sat by the window. The city lights shimmered against the black water of Lake Michigan. I thought about Ethan asleep in his room, about the way he'd looked at me when Monica told him he didn't belong at her table. Something inside me hardened. I didn't want revenge. I wanted respect. But in this family, respect was something you had to take. I reopened George's email and replied simply, "Keep it safe for me. I might need it soon." The next morning, I went to work as usual, the world looking the same, but feeling entirely different. The numbers on my computer screen blurred together as I thought of that house, the one with my father's old porch, hidden under Monica's designer renovations. I imagined peeling back the layers until only the truth remained. That evening, as I walked home through the cold, I called my lawyer friend Mark. He specialized in property law. We hadn't talked in months, but when I told him I needed advice about a title issue, his voice sharpened. "Emily, are you in trouble?" "No," I said, "but someone else might be." He laughed softly, not understanding. We set a time to meet. I hung up before I could change my mind. That night, Ethan asked if we could bake cookies for his classmates. He handed me a flower-covered recipe card, smiling like nothing in the world could touch him. I smiled back, feeling both proud and protective. He deserved a family that saw his worth. He deserved a seat at every table. When he went to bed, I stood in the kitchen looking at the faint reflection of my face in the window. Behind it, the city glowed restless and bright. I thought of Monica's dining room, of the laughter that had excluded us, and of George's quiet nod. I didn't know exactly what would come next, only that the silence I'd kept for years was about to end, and when it did, it would speak louder than anything Monica had ever built. Weeks passed quietly after that night, but the quiet didn't feel the same. It was sharp now, deliberate, like a breath held too long. I worked, cooked, helped Ethan with his homework, but my thoughts kept drifting back to that house on Hillcrest Drive. I hadn't told him anything. He was only 8. All he needed to know was that his mother wasn't finished being invisible. Spring arrived late that year. One Sunday afternoon, I drove to Mom's house in West Haven to drop off groceries. She lived alone now, though she liked to act as if she had a full schedule of luncheons and church committees. When I walked in, the smell of potpourri hit me like a wall. Mom looked up from her recliner. "Emily, you really should learn to do your hair like Monica's. It lifts your face." I smiled politely. "She looks good, Mom." Mom sighed dramatically, folding her magazine. "You two are so different. She knows when to speak and when to stay quiet. That's what people respect." The words hung in the air. I forced a small laugh, setting the groceries down. Maybe I'm still learning. Her eyes flicked toward me, unreadable. She changed the subject, asking about Ethan's school and the weather. I answered automatically, my mind elsewhere. When I left, the sun was setting behind the maple trees, painting the sky gold. For a moment, I thought of Dad's voice again, steady and sure, reminding me that truth had its own patience. A few weeks later, an invitation arrived in the mail. Monica was hosting another party, a fundraiser this time. The envelope was thick, the handwriting perfect. I almost threw it away, but curiosity won. The night of the event, I dressed simply and drove out to the neighborhood I once knew too well. The house glowed from the street, every window lit, laughter spilling onto the lawn. Guests filled the driveway, stepping out of black sedans and hugging Monica like she was royalty. Inside, the air smelled of money and flowers. She spotted me near the doorway and hesitated for half a second before regaining her perfect smile. "Emily, you made it." I nodded, my voice even. "Just wanted to stop by and see how things were." Her friends glanced over, curious. Monica guided me toward the kitchen, lowering her voice. "You really didn't have to come. These are mostly business people, not family." I looked around at the crystal glasses, the polished silver, the photographs of her family framed on every wall. I wanted to ask where Dad's picture had gone. Instead, I said, "Seems like things are good for you." She smiled tightly. "They are. Hard work pays off." Something in the way she said it made me pause. Her tone carried that same superiority I'd heard my whole life, but beneath it was strain. Her eyes flickered toward the counter where a thick stack of papers lay beside a laptop. She noticed me looking. "That's nothing, just boring paperwork." Before I could reply, someone called her name and she drifted away. I waited until no one was near the counter, then glanced at the top sheet. My chest tightened. It was a refinancing agreement, and the signature line didn't say Monica Turner. It said Emily Turner. My name, my handwriting copied almost perfectly. I stood frozen, pulse hammering. She had done it again. Not just the house, not just the lies. She was now using my identity to secure another loan. I folded the paper slightly enough to see the notary seal. The date was recent, the bank local. Someone bumped into me laughing, and I forced a smile, putting the paper down as if nothing had happened. My legs felt unsteady as I walked outside into the cool night air. I sat in the car, breathing through the anger. She wasn't just trying to erase me anymore. She was building her empire on my name. At home, after putting Ethan to bed, I opened my laptop and typed a message to George. "I found something tonight. Monica's refinancing the property using my signature. Is there any way to start legal proceedings quietly?" His reply came within an hour. "You can, and you should. The law's slow, but truth's slower. Keep everything. Don't confront her yet." I read his message 3 times. The glow of the screen reflected in the window, catching my face in the dark glass. I looked older than I remembered. Tired, but clear. The next morning, I went through my old folders, pulling out every document related to the house. Deeds, payment receipts, tax statements, even the mortgage acquisition papers from Whitmore Trust. Each piece of paper was a fragment of something I had tried to bury. At work, my concentration evaporated. Numbers blurred again. Clients talked about budgets and deadlines, and all I could see was my name on Monica's loan. That night, while Ethan colored at the kitchen table, I printed a copy of the document I'd seen at her party. I wasn't sure why I'd taken the photo, only that I'd needed proof. Ethan looked up from his drawing. "Mom, are you mad at Aunt Monica?" I hesitated. "No, sweetheart. Why do you ask?" He shrugged. "You look like when you're trying not to yell." I laughed softly. "Maybe I'm just thinking too much." He slid the paper across the table toward me. It was a drawing of a long dining table surrounded by people. In the corner, 2 small figures sat by a window, just me and him. Everyone else was turned away. "That's our family," he said proudly. I nodded, throat tight. "It's beautiful, baby." After he went to bed, I stared at the drawing for a long time. The faces turned away felt too real. Outside, the city was quiet. I picked up my phone, opened George's message again, and whispered into the stillness, "You're right. I should start now." I didn't know how long it would take or how many lies I'd have to uncover, but I knew one thing for certain. I wouldn't let her write me out of the picture again. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The sun poured through the blinds of my apartment sharp and clean, as if daring me to stop hiding. I called George before I could talk myself out of it. He answered on the second ring, his voice steady but cautious. He must have known something had changed in me. We met at a small coffee shop on Main Street, the kind with chipped mugs and a bell that rang when the door opened. It was early quiet except for the hiss of the espresso machine and the low hum of conversation. George sat near the window, a worn leather folder resting on the table. He looked smaller than I remembered, but his eyes held the same calm certainty as the night we first spoke. He pushed the folder toward me when I sat down. Inside were photocopies of old documents, yellowed and fragile. My father's handwriting filled the pages, clear and deliberate. Half the house to Emily, half to Monica. I ran my fingers over the faded ink. George spoke quietly. Your father wanted fairness, but Monica, she changed the game. After he passed, she paid off the notary. It wasn't hard. People do strange things for money. My stomach tightened. The air around us seemed to still. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a smaller envelope. I kept this, he said, the original will. It's yours if you want to fight. I looked at him. You could have destroyed this or sold it. Why keep it all these years? He smiled faintly. Maybe I wanted to believe someone would come looking for the truth. I left the cafe holding that envelope like it was alive. On the sidewalk, the world seemed louder, the traffic, the voices, even the wind. I walked to my car in a daze. The betrayal didn't feel sharp anymore. It felt heavy, almost ancient, as if it had been sitting quietly waiting for me to uncover it. That evening, after Ethan went to bed, I spread the papers across my kitchen table. The words blurred, but the meaning was crystal clear. My sister hadn't just stolen my place at the table. She had rewritten the story of our family. I wasn't going to let it stand. I called Mark, my lawyer friend. When he picked up, I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, then exhaled slowly. We can start a quiet title action, he said. It won't be fast, but it's clean. If she forged anything, we'll prove it. Quiet title. The words felt right. Not loud, not angry, just final. I told him to move forward. Over the next few weeks, I lived two lives. By day, I was the same quiet mother going to work helping Ethan with school projects, pretending nothing had changed. By night, I gathered records, bank statements, tax filings, anything that tied Monica's house back to Whitmore Trust. Every document was a thread, and I was finally learning how to pull them. Then one morning, Monica appeared in the local paper. There she was on the front page, smiling beside a reporter. The headline read, "Local entrepreneur expands her family legacy." In the article, she talked about her heritage home, about how her family had built everything from hard work and perseverance. My coffee went cold in my hand. Heritage, I thought. She had stolen even that word. I clipped the article and put it in my file, a record of her lies printed for the world to see. A few days later, I got an email from the bank about a mailing address update. The notice was addressed to me, referencing the property at Hillcrest Drive. It wasn't an error. My name was on the file again, right where it belonged. I didn't say a word to anyone, but the small victory steadied me. That weekend, I decided to take Ethan to the park near our old neighborhood. He ran ahead, chasing pigeons, his laughter echoing in the crisp air. As I stood there watching him, I saw Michael, Monica's husband, coming out of the grocery store nearby. He didn't notice me at first. When our eyes met, he froze, then gave a nervous wave. We exchanged a few polite words. He looked thinner than I remembered, the kind of tired that didn't come from work. Before leaving, he said quietly, "You know, the bank sent a letter last week. Your name was on it." Monica was furious. She said it was a mistake, but I don't think so. His voice trailed off as if he'd already said too much. He left with a bag of groceries, and I stood there, heart pounding. The cracks were showing, and she couldn't patch them fast enough. A week later, I sent Monica a card. It was simple, cream-colored, no return address. Inside, I wrote, "Happy Thanksgiving," from the rightful homeowner. I didn't expect a response, but I could picture her reading it, the smile freezing on her face. That night, I imagined her reaction, the sound of the envelope tearing open, the flicker of realization, the dread curling in her chest. Somewhere in that big, perfect house, she'd finally feel what I had felt for years, the ground shifting beneath her feet. Later I learned from Mark that the bank had contacted her again, asking to confirm ownership details. The quiet title action had started to ripple through the system. Official letters had my name, not hers. Her perfect world was beginning to shake silently. I didn't celebrate. Not yet. I knew this wasn't over. Monica called a few days later, her voice syrup-sweet but trembling underneath. "Emily, I just got some strange mail from the bank. I think there's been a mix-up with your company name." I smiled into the phone. "I'll look into it," I said softly. "Maybe it's just the system catching up." There was a pause long enough for me to hear her breathing quicken. Then she hung up. That night I poured myself a glass of wine and sat by the window watching the city lights blur. The storm hadn't come yet, but I could feel the pressure building thick and electric in the air. It wouldn't be loud when it arrived. It would come quietly, like truth always did. A year passed before anyone realized how much had changed. The lawsuit moved slowly, quietly, like a tide creeping up the shore. By the time it was done, the papers were signed, the title confirmed, and the house at 29 Hillcrest Drive was legally mine. I didn't celebrate. I didn't even tell anyone except Mark and George. I wanted her to find out the way I had unexpectedly surrounded by people who thought they knew her. When November came again, the town glowed with lights and pumpkins on porches. Every store window smelled of cinnamon and pie crust. I kept to myself that week, baking with Ethan, trying to ignore the noise on television. But then I saw her face on the local news. Monica Turner, local entrepreneur, hosting Thanksgiving dinner to honor her family's legacy. The reporter smiled too widely, praising her for preserving the Fairbanks heritage home. Ethan looked up from his homework. "Mom, that's Aunt Monica. Are we going there?" I shook my head. "Not this time, sweetheart." He didn't ask why. Maybe he already knew. The next day I found the invitation in my mailbox anyway. It wasn't mailed. Someone had dropped it off by hand. Heavy cardstock gold letters, her name printed in bold across the top. Underneath a single line, "Family always has a place at my table." For a moment, I almost laughed. It was like she was daring me. That evening I pulled out the blue dress I'd worn once years ago to a company gala. Simple, elegant, nothing flashy. I didn't call or RSVP. I didn't need permission to walk into what already belonged to me. Thanksgiving afternoon came gray and cold, the sky low with clouds. I parked down the street and walked the last block. The house shimmered with lights, every window glowing. Through the front door I could see cameras, microphones, guests in sequined dresses. She had turned the holiday into a stage. Inside, the scent of rosemary and roasted turkey hit me. Monica stood at the center of the room, perfect as ever, surrounded by people complimenting her decor. When she saw me, her smile flickered for just a second before she recovered. "Emily, you came. I didn't think you would." I met her gaze evenly. "It's Thanksgiving. Family should be together." Her lips tightened, but she nodded to a server. "Get her a seat near the back." I followed quietly, taking a chair by the corner near the bay window. Ethan sat beside me, fidgeting with his napkin. The cameras began to roll. A reporter stood by the table asking Monica about her journey, her resilience, her family's legacy. She spoke like she'd rehearsed it 100 times. Every word tasted false. When the toast began, she lifted her glass high. "To family, to perseverance, and to this house, our symbol of everything we've built." The room clapped politely. That was when Ethan, reaching for his glass of juice, knocked it over. It spilled across the white tablecloth, spreading like a stain under the golden centerpiece. He froze. Monica's face twisted, the charm slipping. Her voice sliced through the noise. "Maybe people who don't understand their place shouldn't sit at this table." Every sound in the room died. Forks stilled. Even the cameraman hesitated. I felt Ethan's hand shake in mine. His lip trembled, but he said nothing. I stood up slowly. My chair scraped against the floor. The sound was small, but final. "You're right. I said, my voice steady. Not everyone belongs at this table. I reached into my bag and pulled out the folder I had carried for a year. The edges were worn from all the times I had almost opened it, almost thrown it away. I set it on the table in front of her. Especially, I continued, tenants. She blinked. What are you talking about? George stepped forward from the crowd. He wasn't dressed for a party. His jacket was wrinkled, his expression grave. I'm talking about ownership, he said. The reporter looked between us, sensing a story. Monica laughed weakly, trying to wave it off. This is ridiculous. George unfolded a single document and laid it beside the wine glasses. The original deed notarized and signed. My father's signature still strong and sure. He looked at her, then at me. Your sister owns this property, Mrs. Turner. It's all been verified. Whispers filled the room. Cameras clicked. Monica's skin drained of color. Her husband Michael stood abruptly, his jaw tight. She turned to him, but he wouldn't meet her eyes. Michael, she whispered. He swallowed. I knew Monica. I didn't want to believe it, but I knew. She stared at him like the floor had vanished beneath her feet. The camera lights glared against the glass walls, catching every tremor of her face. I didn't move. The silence stretched long enough to make everyone uncomfortable. Then I said quietly, You've always wanted control. Now you have the freedom to live with the consequences. No one spoke after that. The clinking glasses, the hum of conversation, all gone. Only the slow hiss of the fireplace filled the space between us. I took Ethan's hand and turned toward the door. The cameras followed for a moment before someone turned them away. Outside, the air was cold and clean. My heart pounded, but it wasn't rage anymore. It was release. As we walked down the street, Ethan looked up at me. Mom, are we in trouble? I smiled faintly. No, baby. We're finally home. Behind us, the laughter inside the house had vanished completely. The night stood still, heavy and certain. The truth had arrived quietly, just as I knew it would. For a few days after that dinner, everything went quiet again. Too quiet. The papers had been filed, the title confirmed, and Monica had retreated from the public eye. The news spread through town like a whisper behind closed doors. People talked about the Thanksgiving scandal in hushed tones, about the woman who lost everything in a single night. Part of me almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Then one morning I woke up to a soft tapping sound from Ethan's room. I found him sitting at my desk with the laptop open, frowning at the screen. He looked up when I entered. Mom, something's wrong with your computer. It keeps flashing. I leaned over him. The cursor was moving on its own, windows opening and closing, files being accessed that I hadn't touched in months. My heart dropped. I turned off the Wi-Fi and shut the lid. Ethan's eyes widened. Did I break it? No, sweetheart. You didn't. After I sent him to get ready for school, I powered it back on and checked the logs. Someone had been in my system for hours, digging through the folders tied to Whitmore Trust. I wasn't sure what they were looking for, but I could guess who had sent them. By noon, I had Mark trace the IP addresses. His call came before dinner. Emily, this might sound strange, but the address points back to Chicago. A personal account under the name Ryan Cooper. The sound of that name hit me like a fist. My ex-husband. We hadn't spoken in years beyond the few polite emails about Ethan's school. He had left when things got hard, when the bills piled up, and I refused to pretend our marriage was still whole. He wasn't cruel, just cowardly, but this was different. That night I called him. He answered on the third ring. His voice was cautious. Emily, I didn't yell. What did you do? Silence. Then a sigh. It's not what you think. You hacked my accounts, Ryan. Tell me why. He hesitated. She came to me, he said finally. Monica. She told me you'd stolen her house, that you were laundering money through Whitmore Trust. She said if I helped, she'd pay me enough to get back on my feet. I closed my eyes. So you believed her? I wanted to, he said quietly, until I saw her in the papers smiling like none of it mattered. I started digging, and I realized what she was doing. I didn't touch your files after that. But the hacker she hired did. My pulse thudded. You're saying she hired someone else? Yes, some tech guy from New Jersey. I recorded the call, M. Her voice, the payment details, everything. I couldn't stop her, but I can give it to you. I didn't know what to say. For the first time in years, I heard something almost human in his tone. Regret. Send it to me, I said. The audio arrived an hour later. I sat in the dark living room while Ethan slept, listening to Monica's smooth, familiar voice. She told someone to fabricate documents to create false records showing Whitmore Trust had been registered under fraudulent names. She even mentioned leaking it to a journalist she knew. When it ended, my hands were trembling. But it wasn't rage this time. It was resolve. I forwarded the file to Mark and to Detective Harper, the officer who had handled the title verification last year. Within 20 minutes, she replied, "We'll handle this. Do not contact her." By morning, the police had already traced the data breach. Monica's phone was confiscated, her emails pulled from the server. Every thread pointed back to her. I didn't tell Ethan what was happening, but he knew something was different. He watched me over breakfast, studying my face. "Are you mad at Aunt Monica again?" I smiled faintly. "No, honey. I'm just letting the grown-ups clean up their mess." Later that afternoon, I got a call from Mark. "They brought her in for questioning," he said. "They have everything. The audio, the bank transactions, the digital fingerprints. It's over." I nodded, but I didn't feel victory, only the steady quiet of justice settling into place. That evening, while Ethan did his homework, I opened the window and let the cold November air in. I thought about Monica in that interrogation room, her designer coat folded neatly over a chair, her words twisting into excuses. For years she had told me I wasn't enough. Not graceful enough, not wealthy enough, not worthy enough to sit beside her. Now the silence she once weaponized was hers to live in. When the phone rang again, it was Detective Harper. Her voice was calm but firm. "Emily, we'll need your statement tomorrow, but I wanted you to know." She admitted to hiring the hacker. Claimed it was to protect her reputation, not harm you. I let out a slow breath. Of course she did. "We'll finish the paperwork," Harper said. "She'll be charged with cyber fraud and identity misuse. I'll keep you updated." After the call, I stood by the window looking out at the skyline. The city lights flickered like scattered embers. In the reflection, I saw my own face, tired but free. Ethan wandered in, rubbing his eyes. "Mom, can we have dinner now?" "Yeah, baby, we can." As I set the table, a thought surfaced, quiet and unshakable. She'd spent her life trying to decide who deserved a seat and who didn't. But justice, I realized, always had its own chair waiting. I placed 2 plates down and poured water into our glasses. The air smelled of calm, and something else I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. The peace didn't last long. 2 weeks later, Detective Harper called again. She sounded different this time, heavier somehow. "Emily, you should come down to the precinct. We found something." When I arrived, she was waiting in one of the interview rooms with a small rusted box on the table. The edges were corroded, the latch bent, but still locked. She tapped it gently with her pen. "It was found during a search of your sister's basement, hidden behind a false wall." I felt the air shift around me. "What's inside?" Harper nodded to an officer who used a small tool to pry the lock. Inside lay a few brittle papers, yellowed at the corners, wrapped carefully in a cloth. The officer handed them to her, and she read quietly, before passing them to me. My father's handwriting filled the page, familiar and certain. It wasn't the will I'd seen before. This one was dated a few weeks before he died. In bold ink he had written, "The house shall belong to Emily, the one who protects, not destroys." My throat tightened. I stared at the words until they blurred. Harper spoke softly. "This version was never filed. Looks like someone replaced it before probate." I already knew who. The trial started the following month. Monica was charged with fraud, falsifying records, and cyber intrusion. The courthouse smelled faintly of old paper and coffee. I sat near the front, not to gloat, but because I wanted to see everything end. When they brought her in, she looked smaller. The perfect hair, the sharp clothes all gone. She glanced at me once her eyes red, then looked away. The judge read through the charges while her attorney muttered in her ear. When the prosecutor asked her to explain why she'd forged the documents, Monica's voice trembled. She said it was never meant to go that far, that she'd only done it to protect the family name. She said she couldn't stand the thought of people knowing her sister was divorced, raising a child alone. Her words twisted like knives. Protect the family. She made it sound noble. Then the prosecutor asked if anyone had told her to do it. Monica hesitated, glancing at the benches behind her. Mom sat there clutching her purse like a lifeline. Monica's voice broke. Mom told me to. She said people talk that a divorced woman owning the family home would ruin our reputation. A gasp rippled through the room. Mom froze, then straightened her expression, turning to polished calm. When the judge asked her to approach, she stood slowly, her heels clicking against the tile. She denied it at first, but the emails told a different story. Copies recovered from Monica's phone showed their conversations, Mom urging her to fix the paperwork to make sure the house stayed in respectable hands. Watching her on the stand felt like watching glass crack. The woman who had taught me manners and restraint, who had told me silence was strength, was the one who'd built the cage I'd lived in for years. When it was my turn to testify, I walked to the stand with steady steps. My hands didn't shake. The prosecutor asked simple questions about the house, the company, the documents. I answered clearly. Then he asked how I felt about my sister and mother. I looked at Monica first. Her shoulders were shaking, her face streaked with tears. Then I looked at Mom. She sat stone still, eyes fixed on some invisible point ahead. I said, I'm not angry anymore. Anger kept me quiet too long. I don't need anyone to admit they were wrong. I just want peace. The courtroom went silent. The judge studied me for a long moment, then turned to Monica's lawyer. When it was over, the charges stuck. Monica would serve community time and pay restitution. The judge's final question caught me off guard. Miss Turner, what do you plan to do with the property now that it's officially yours? I hesitated, the weight of the question sinking in. The house had been a battlefield, a prison, a wound. Now it could be something else. I said I'm going to rebuild it into a place where no one is ever turned away. The judge nodded. That's a noble answer. After court, I walked out into the cold afternoon light. Reporters hovered at the bottom of the steps, their cameras flashing. I didn't speak to any of them. Mom brushed past me without a word, her perfume sharp in the wind. Monica stopped a few feet away, looking lost. She whispered, I didn't mean to ruin everything. I met her eyes. You didn't ruin it, Monica. You just showed what was already broken. She looked down and walked away. That night I drove past Hillcrest Drive. The house sat dark, its windows blank, like eyes that had seen too much. The porch where Dad used to sit was covered in leaves. I parked and stepped out, the cold biting through my coat. In the trunk of my car was a small box of tools and plans for renovation. The new paperwork had come through that morning. The house was fully mine. Ethan would never know the weight of the lies it once held. He'd only know what it became after. I stood there for a while, listening to the wind move through the trees until the air smelled like autumn again. Tomorrow I would call the contractors, meet with the designer, start over. But tonight, I let the quiet settle in. Peace didn't erase what happened. It built something stronger in its place. And for the first time, I felt ready to begin again. A full year passed before I let myself walk through the front door again. The smell of fresh paint still hung in the air, soft and clean, mixed with the faint scent of new wood and cinnamon. The house didn't feel like a monument anymore. It breathed. The creak in the floor by the hallway was still there. The sunlight still cut through the same corner windows, but everything else was different. On the front sign by the gate, a new name had been carved into smooth cedar Whitmore House. It wasn't a mansion now, not really. It was a shelter, a place for women who needed to start over, for mothers who had run out of safe places, for children who deserved better beginnings. I had used the settlement money and the remainder of Dad's old trust to restore it room by room. Volunteers helped, local carpenters donated their time, and every wall carried a layer of stories that didn't belong to shame anymore. The morning light hit the dining room first. The long wooden table had been refinished, glowing honey gold beneath the chandeliers. I traced my fingers across the grain, remembering the day I had once been told I didn't belong here. That memory used to burn. Now it hummed quietly, part of the foundation. Ethan ran in taller now, his hair a little longer. He carried a box of folded napkins and dropped them gently onto the table. He grinned up at me. "They're coming soon, Mom. The new families. Do you think they'll like it?" I smiled. "I think they'll love it." He nodded proudly and began setting the table with practiced care. He lined each plate and fork with exact precision. Somewhere inside me, the old ache softened. He would never have to fight for a seat again. By noon, the first guests arrived. A woman with tired eyes holding the hand of a small girl. A teenager with a bruised backpack and nowhere else to go. Volunteers greeted them, offered tea, helped them find rooms upstairs. The house filled slowly with the sounds of footsteps, laughter, a baby crying, then calming, life returning. Monica came that afternoon. She stood at the doorway holding a covered pie dish, uncertain, like someone approaching a memory that still stings. Her hair was shorter now, her clothes plain, her makeup gone. For a moment we just looked at each other. She spoke first. "It's pumpkin," she said softly. "I baked it this morning. I thought maybe the kids would like it." I stepped aside. "Come in, Monica. There's room." She hesitated before crossing the threshold, eyes flicking toward the walls lined with new photographs. Volunteers, families, laughter frozen in color. No trace of the old portraits, no trophies, no curated perfection. Just people. She walked with me to the kitchen where a few women were stirring soup. The air smelled of garlic and butter, warm and real. She placed the pie on the counter, wiped her hands nervously. "I never thanked you," she whispered. "Not for what you did in court, but for this. For turning the house into something good." I looked at her not as my rival or my ghost, but as someone who had fallen hard and survived. "You can thank me by helping. There's always something to do here." She nodded quickly, relief flashing across her face. "I'll come back tomorrow. Maybe I can help paint the fence." Ethan ran in again, breathless from excitement. "Aunt Monica, look. We set the table for everyone. There's a seat for you, too." Her eyes shimmered. She knelt, hugging him tightly. "Thank you, kiddo." Later that evening, the house was full. The table stretched long under the warm, light, mismatched chairs pulled close together. The smell of dinner wrapped around us like a blanket. I watched everyone take their seats, laughter weaving through the clinking of silverware. For a moment, I could almost see Dad at the end of the table nodding approvingly. Mom arrived late. She walked slowly through the doorway holding a tin wrapped in foil. She looked older, smaller than I remembered. She paused at the threshold, as if unsure she was welcome. I stood and went to her. "You came." She nodded. "I heard what you've done here." She handed me the tin. "Pumpkin bread, the old recipe." I took it gently. "Thank you." Her voice wavered. "I was wrong, Emily. I cared more about appearances than people. I thought I was protecting us, but I was only protecting an illusion." For the first time in years, I saw something genuine in her eyes. Not pride, not denial, just truth. I placed a hand on her shoulder. "Sit down, Mom. Dinner's ready." She hesitated, then smiled faintly and followed me to the table. Ethan stood at the head, his voice small but steady. "Before we eat, can we say what we're thankful for?" Everyone nodded. He looked around, then said, "I'm thankful we all have a place now. Nobody has to sit by themselves." A quiet settled over the room, not heavy but full. I felt my throat tighten. I looked down the table at faces once strangers, now bound by something fragile and kind. As dinner began, I glanced at the photograph hanging on the far wall. It was my father smiling in the yard decades ago, sunlight spilling over his shoulders. The gold frame caught the light, scattering it across the room until every face glowed a little brighter. I thought of all the tables I'd sat at in my life, the ones that welcomed me, the ones that didn't, and the one that brought me here. When everyone had their plates, I raised my glass slightly. The table isn't just a place to eat. It's where we find out who we are when no one is watching. The chatter returned soft and joyful. Monica served soup to the new arrivals. Mom cut the pie. Ethan poured juice with both hands. Outside, snow began to fall, catching the light from the windows. Through the glass, I saw the wooden sign I'd hung by the door earlier that morning. It read simply, "For those who were told they didn't belong." I watched the flakes blur against the light, the warmth from inside spilling into the cold night. For the first time, the house didn't feel haunted by what it had been. It felt alive with what it could still become. Maybe that's what home really was. Not the walls or the past, but the people who finally found a seat together. And as the laughter rose again around me, I knew I had finally found mine too. If this story touched you, tell me what home means to you. Maybe we all have a table waiting somewhere, just waiting for the right hands to set it.